Today you are going to be participating in another bookish trust exercise. We have part 2. So part 1 of this video I posted a few weeks ago, and that was books I think you should go into not reading the plot, not knowing anything about the stories. And then I got a very interesting comment. This person proposed the antithesis to that video, where I recommend books that I think you should know something about before going into them. And I thought that this was such a great idea. They also mentioned that I often like going into books not knowing too much or not knowing anything at all, and that it could be a bit of a challenge. And this was actually surprisingly easy because I do think that there are certain types of books where I do feel like it is important to go in knowing a little something. And so this is less about the books themselves and more about the type of book that they are. But before I do that, I just want to say a really big thank you. So I have been gone for only a week, little more than a week, because I have been wrapping an endless amount of Etsy orders, and I just want to say the biggest thank you. My last video, I told you guys that I will be traveling to England very soon, and I was doing my last Etsy restock before I leave, and the next time I will do a restock is the beginning of 2025, so it was my last restock before the end of the year, and it was the most products that I had at one time in one restock, and the amount of orders I got was genuinely baffling, and I don't mean to say that to brag or to boast. It was just genuinely so surprising and so heartwarming, and I am incredibly grateful for each and every one of you. You guys, please don't ever feel like you have to order anything from my Etsy shop, but when you do, just know how honored I am that you like my art enough to want to buy it and have it in your home and to use my bookmarks. I don't know why every time before I post a restock, I always think about, like, whenever I have a new item, like, is anybody really going to like this? Like, I like it, so I hope other people would like it too, and I never want to create something that I don't like, obviously. So everything I make, I put so much of myself into, so much of my heart and soul into, and it just warmed my heart to know that you like the things that I create. So I just want to say the biggest thank you. I'm so grateful for all of your support and kindness and love, and you guys just mean the world to me, so thank you so much. Anyway, with that aside, I just wanted to say a huge thank you. Now I will get back into the groove of posting, hopefully twice a week again. Life is getting pretty crazy because I have my cousin's wedding soon, and then I'm leaving soon. So we'll see how many videos I can upload between now and when I go. But anyway, onto the books. I think the first two can be a little predictable because I have mentioned this quite a lot in my videos, but I do think with certain classics, like War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, it is really important to know a little background information before going in. With a lot of classics, I do think it is helpful if they deal with historical context like War and Peace does. War and Peace takes place during the War of 1812 and Napoleon invading Russia, and I do think that if I went into War and Peace blind, I would have no clue what was going on. I did have a lot of prior knowledge about Russian history and Russian literature, and I did research a lot about Tolstoy because he is my favorite writer. So I do think War and Peace is the kind of book where you would be doing yourself such a service to do a little bit of research, even if it's just like 1 or 2 short videos on like a simplified history of the War of 1812 or a little bit of Russian history, just because I think knowing the historical context can deepen your understanding of the story so much, and you can get so much more out of the story with knowing a little bit more of what the world was like and what these people, what the characters were really dealing with, because it is based on a time in history. War and Peace is one of my favorite books of all time. It is completely worth your time and worth your energy and worth researching into so that you can get the most out of the story. But another thing that I always say is that I do feel like with certain classics, it is great to watch an adaptation before reading the books. I did that with War and Peace. I watched the BBC miniseries, and it helped me so much. So yes, I definitely think going in blind to War and Peace is just not the best idea. So I would definitely do your research before this one. The next one, again, this is a hill that I will forever stand on, and that is watching an adaptation before reading this author's books. Now, a lot of people might not agree with me, and that's perfectly fine, but I'm talking about Jane Austen. So when I first started reading Jane Austen, I have a hair on my lip. I think it's gone. When I first started reading Jane Austen, I didn't watch any of the adaptations, and I didn't really do much research into the stories because her language is much different from ours. If you're not familiar with Regency vocabulary, with the way that people in Regency England spoke, or the way that the characters in Jane Austen speak, the way that Jane even narrates herself, it can be a little jarring and a little confusing. I do also feel like when I first started reading Jane Austen, I remember being a little confused by how they got from one location to another location, and I always found it a little bit clunky, if that makes sense, or just a little bit confusing. So I love watching Jane Austen adaptations before reading the books, and I also feel like the more classics, the more Jane Austen you read and you watch, the more comfortable and familiar you will be with the language. It is very, very different from our modern language, so that's why I think it is important to go in with a little bit of knowledge, and maybe to understand a little bit of the story. I feel like with Jane Austen, it's exciting to not know who's going to end up with who or what's going to happen, but I also feel like it is kind of fun, and it's one of those classics. All of her books are those classics that it's kind of hard to not know who ends up with who, but I also think it could be fun just to see how they end up with each other. And then the next one is another classic from one of my favorite writers, and that is E.M. Forster's Aspects of the Novel. So I don't think you should go into this story blind, because it's good to know the context of these essays or these lectures. So the back says, first given as a series of lectures at Cambridge University, Aspects of the Novel is Forster's analysis of this great literary form. Here he rejects the historical view of criticism that considers writers in terms of the period in which they wrote, and instead asks us to imagine the great novelists at work together in a circular room. He discusses aspects of people, plot, fantasy, rhythm, illuminating comparisons between such novelists as Proust and James, Dickens and Thackeray, Eliot and Dostoevsky, the features shared by their books and the ways in which they differ. Written in a wonderfully engaging and conversational manner, this penetrating work of criticism is full of Forster's habitual irreverence, wit, and wisdom. And so I think it's good to know that information. So these are lectures that E.M. Forster gave at Cambridge University on the aspects of the novel form. I always idealize or romanticize the idea of going to Cambridge and studying literature, and I feel like I can do that by reading this book, and that just makes me very happy. So yes, with certain, I would say like non-fictions, I think it's important to have some context before going into them, and to get a taste of what the lectures are like. It's kind of like taking a new class at university and not knowing what you'll be learning in that class. I think it's good to have some basic knowledge on what knowledge will be imparted on you by reading or going to that class, if that analogy makes any sense. So that is Aspects of the Novel, a fantastic book that I highly recommend. The next book is incredibly sweet and so, so beautiful, and that is Letters from Father Christmas by J.R.R. Tolkien. I love this book so much. It's so special. So why you should read the synopsis or the plot of this book is to understand why Tolkien wrote these letters, and the fact that they're not actually letters from Father Christmas. I will explain. The back says, "My dear children, I am more shaky than usual this year. The North Pole bears fault. It was the biggest bang in the world and the most monstrous firework there has ever been. It turned the North Pole black." And then it says, "Every December an envelope bearing a stamp from the North Pole would arrive for J.R.R. Tolkien's children. Inside would be a letter in strange spidery handwriting and a beautiful color drawing. They were from Father Christmas, telling wonderful tales of life at the North Pole. How all the reindeer got loose and scattered presents all over the place. How the accident-prone polar bear climbed to the North Pole and fell through the roof of Father Christmas' house into the dining room. How there were wars with the troublesome horde of goblins who lived in the caves beneath the house. From the first note to Tolkien's eldest son in 1920 to the final poignant letter to his daughter in 1943, This new edition celebrates the centenary of that first letter with a stocking full of charming letters, pictures, and decorated envelopes, and is a festive feast for readers of all ages. This is a stunning book of letters that Tolkien wrote as Father Christmas to his children that he would give them every year. So I think it's very important to know that information before going in, because then it just makes more sense and you get to understand the context and the sweetness of how this book came to be. I just love the fact that Tolkien did this for his kids and that he wanted to make the spirit of Father Christmas come to life even more for them. I just think it's so beautiful. And the fact that he illustrated it as well, because I just think it's so special. It makes it so magical. Christmas is also my favorite time of year, and it just makes it feel magical. And what I love is just making life feel a little bit more magical. So, love this book so much, and I think it's just such a beautiful story, and showing how Tolkien was not only a wonderful writer, but he was such a caring and imaginative father. Imagining him like telling his kids all these stories, and I just have a feeling that they had a very imaginative and enchanting childhood. Although I do want to do more research about Tolkien. I want to learn a bit more about him, which I know some stuff, but I want to know more. You guys know, if you've been here, I love researching about authors' lives, and Tolkien is definitely one of them that I want to research a little bit more about. The next book that I recommend knowing something about before reading it is How to Stop Time by Matt Haig. This is also the illustrated edition, which is illustrated by Chris Riddell, another one of my favorite illustrators. And this book is unlike normal life. So what I mean by that is our main character doesn't age the way that we normally age. And I think it's important to know that information before going in, because it could be a little confusing by how the story is structured. And again, I think this information is good to know before going in, and it is on the front flap. It says, Tom Hazard has a dangerous secret. He may look like an ordinary 41-year-old, but owing to a rare condition, he's been alive for centuries. From Elizabethan England to Jazz Age Paris, from New York to the South Seas, Tom has seen a lot and now craves an ordinary life. And I don't think you need to know much more than that, but I do think it's important to know that. I love this book. It follows this character through the centuries. He meets William Shakespeare at one point. He sees a lot of historical events happen, and that is something that I always think about. One of my favorite questions to ask people, and maybe you guys can comment this down below because I would love to know your answers. If you could go back in time and witness a time period or a historical event, what would you love to witness? My answer always changes, but I feel like a lot of them have to do with writing and art. One of my favorites is just to be able to watch like Monet paint his water lilies, or to just watch Monet like in his garden or something. There are so many. Maybe I can list my own answers in the description box or something, or I can comment them. I would love to know your answers. So anyway, this is a fantastic book that I highly recommend. The next book is Animal Farm, and this mainly is about dystopian books. I think when you're reading a dystopian, because it's different from our normal world, you go in knowing that, but I think it's important to know maybe a little bit of how the world is different from our normal world. So the first sentence of this synopsis is, a farm is taken over by its overworked, mistreated animals. And even that I think is enough. Maybe you don't have to read the whole synopsis like I said about How to Stop Time. We didn't read the whole synopsis of that one, but it just gives you a little something. Animal Farm is a fantastic book, one of George Orwell's best and of course most beloved. The next one is one of my favorite books, and I actually bought it because of how beautifully written the synopsis on the back cover was. So sometimes the synopsis can be the catalyst to making you want to buy a book, which I feel like that could be very important. It could also be particularly helpful if you are unfamiliar with the writer's work. If you haven't heard them before, haven't heard of the book, haven't heard of the author, then maybe you're a little intrigued. For me, I was intrigued by the cover of this book because it was so beautiful. So this is Upstream by Mary Oliver. At the time that I saw this book in Barnes & Noble, I remember seeing the cover and thinking, how gorgeous is this book? I loved the photo of the trees, I loved the font, I loved just the cover design, but at the time I hadn't heard of Mary Oliver, or if I did, I didn't really know much about her, and I was just so intrigued by how beautiful this book was. So then I naturally flipped it over and read the synopsis, and I immediately took it home. So sometimes reading the synopsis can make you want to buy the book. So the back of this one says, I had to go out into the world and see it and hear it and react to it before I knew at all who I was, what I wanted to be. So begins Upstream, a collection of essays in which poet Mary Oliver reflects on her willingness to lose herself within the beauty and mysteries of the natural world and the world of literature. Emphasizing the significance of her childhood friend, Walt Whitman, and Walt Whitman is one of my favorite poets, probably my favorite poet as well as now Mary Oliver, but at the time I was like, oh my god, she sees Walt Whitman as a friend? Like, then I feel like, then she'll feel like a friend because she sees him as a friend. So it's like kindred spirits, kind of. So it says, her childhood friend, Walt Whitman, who inspired her to vanish into the world of her own writing. Oliver meditates on the forces that allowed her to create a life for herself out of work and love. Throughout this collection, Oliver positions not just herself upstream, but us as well, as she encourages us all to keep moving, to lose ourselves in the awe of the unknown, and to give power and time to the creative and whimsical urges that live within us. The second I read that, I was like, you're coming home with me. So I bought this book, I read it, it's now one of my favorites of all time. It is a beautiful essay collection. Mary Oliver is now one of my all-time favorite poets, and I truly do feel like I have a friend in her. And if you love nature, you love literature, oh, you will love this book so much. The last book I want to mention, I don't actually have a physical copy of, but I wanted to mention it because of the type of story that it is. So the book that I want to mention is Speak by Laurie Halse Andersen. I read this book in high school, and it is about a young girl being sexually assaulted, pretty much. That's the basic plot line, and how that affects her. And I remember reading it in high school and being incredibly devastated by it. An important type of book that you should read the plot before going in is a book that you know has trigger warnings or has things that could affect you on a emotional level. So Speak is a beautiful, important, powerful story. That story will always stick in my head because it really was the first time, especially with a book that I read in high school, that I was so affected by it and I felt so anxious while reading it. And that was the first time I remember really feeling that way. So I do think it's important to look into trigger warnings when there are some. These are all fantastic books that I highly recommend. I hope that this video was helpful or fun or interesting. I really hope it is helpful because sometimes I do think it can be a little tricky. Like, I don't want to spoil myself before going into a book that I haven't read yet, but I also might want to know a little something about them before. I always read synopses with a bit of trepidation because sometimes it's like, this could either be helpful or it could spoil the whole thing for me. It could ruin the whole thing. So read your plots, maybe with a little bit of caution. But anyway, again, I hope this was helpful. I would love to know what books you think you should read the plot before reading the whole book. I would be interested to know, and I would love to know what you are currently reading. Anyway, without further rambling on, I will see you very soon in another video, and as always, happy reading!